Thank you all for coming tonight. Mark, just to let you know that when I ran through this talk earlier this evening, it came out at 15 minutes and 46 seconds. So I'm ready. I'm going to talk to you today about a problem in moral philosophy that's often called the non-identity problem. And like every good problem in philosophy, it starts out with two claims that intuitively seem pretty darn reasonable. The first is a claim about how you came into existence. It's called the time dependence claim. I'm not going to give you a birds and a bees talk. I assume you've already had it, but the basic thought is that you are the result of the conjunction of a unique sperm and egg. Both of these things had a lifespan. If enough time goes by, they're going to be different sperms and eggs. And if you hadn't been conceived within maybe at most a month of when you were actually conceived, you wouldn't exist. Sound pretty good so far? Okay, I'm not a biologist, but this seems pretty right to me. The second is something called the person-affecting principle. And the basic idea here is that an act is wrong only if it harms some individual or individuals, where harming involves making them worse off than they otherwise would have been. This seems right to me, too, right? What else could harming be except making somebody worse off than how they would have been had that action not happened? And when we think about the way we use the language of wronging, it seems to track harming pretty darn closely, right? Think about the legal system. Somebody wrongs you, you go to court, and you try to get compensation for that. What are you being compensated for? The harm you suffered. So the person-affecting principle, that sounds pretty good, too. Most of the time, the time dependence claim and the person-affecting principle play nice with our pre-philosophical moral intuitions. So take the following case. This is the case of Mary, Mike, and later, Marcus. Mary and Mike are a married couple, and they've just found out that they're going to be expecting their first child. And they're very elated at this news, but it's a little bit ill-timed. Why? Because they're about to go on a tropical vacation in a location that's recently reported instances of the Zika virus. Now think back to last summer. I know it feels like an entire world ago, but you'll recall that the Zika virus is a virus that's transmitted via mosquito bites. If it affects an adult, the symptoms are very, very mild. At most, you're going to feel like you have just a slight cold. But if it affects a pregnant woman, it has a chance of also infecting her fetus, and this is where things get super dicey. The Zika virus, in a lot of developing fetuses, causes a birth defect known as microcephaly, basically a statistically smaller than average head. And this is associated with a host of cognitive defects. Children born with microcephaly often struggle to have any sort of communication. They have a very low IQ, and they're unlikely to have much, if any, independence through the course of their life. And suppose that Mary and Mike know all about this. They know what Zika is, they know that they're traveling to an area that has the Zika virus, and they just say, you know what, we'll take our chances, we need a vacation. And suppose that, as luck would have it, Mary is infected with the virus, and 8 months later, Marcus is born with microcephaly, and he's very unhappy at this fact. Now Marcus, we're going to assume, lives a life that's worth living. That is, his life for him is good enough that we can say that it's better for him that he exists than that he doesn't exist. And yet despite this, Mark suffers from pretty significant hardships. He has physical pain, and he also struggles to do the sorts of things that we don't have to struggle to do. So that's couple one. If we go back to the previous slide, we'll see that the person-affecting principle seems perfectly apt here. We can reasonably say that Marcus was harmed by his parents' decision to go on vacation, and also that he was wronged by that decision. We'd understand, for instance, if somebody on Marcus's behalf would seek compensation against the parents, or at very least, the parents might feel like they owe him a significant apology. And he was harmed because he existed at the time that they were making the decision, and he was made worse off by the decision that they made. So let's skip ahead to another couple. This is Jane, John, and later, Jeremy. Jane and John happen to be at the very resort that Mike and Mary are traveling to. And on the first night of their vacation, Jane and John decide that it's time to start their beautiful family. Now suppose that Jane and John are fully aware that they're in a location that has reported instances of the Zika virus. They know what effects this can have on developing fetuses. They know what risks they will run. And as such, they have a decision to make. They can either start trying to start their family in this tropical paradise, and that sounds pretty good, or they can wait a few months, go back to their dreary Midwestern town, where things aren't quite as romantic, and then start trying then. Well, it's a no-brainer for Jane and John. They say, you know what, I'm going to take the risk, go for it, sun, sand, surf, and, and sure enough, 9 months later, Jane and John give birth to Jeremy, who, like Marcus, suffers from microcephaly. Now, like Marcus, Jeremy's life is absolutely worth living, but it comes with very significant hardships. He can't do the sorts of things that we are able to do without any real effort. Now, we'd like to be able to say that Jeremy has the same sort of claim against his parents that Marcus has against his. After all, it's as a result of their decision to conceive him in a tropical paradise rather than waiting, as a result of that, he suffers significant hardship. But it seems that we can't say that. Why? Because although Marcus existed at the time that his parents made the decision to go on vacation, Jeremy didn't. If Jeremy's parents had made a different decision, if they had decided to wait, a different sperm and a different egg would have combined and a different child would have resulted. Now we can assume that Jeremy's life is worth living. Why? Because I've stipulated that it is. So it seems like we can't say that Jeremy was made worse off by the decision that caused him to exist. So the challenge that the non-identity problem poses for us is to figure out a way to explain how somebody can be wronged by the very same action that's a condition of their existence. We can formulate the challenge like this. Premise 1, John and Jane's decision to conceive Jeremy on vacation doesn't make him worse off than he otherwise would have been. Premise 2, an act harms someone if and only if it causes them to be worse off than they otherwise would have been. We can draw conclusion 1, therefore John and Jane didn't harm Jeremy through that decision. Add in premise 3, if Jeremy wasn't harmed by an act, then he also wasn't wronged by it, and we get the next conclusion. Therefore, John and Jane's decision didn't wrong Jeremy. Now, the non-identity problem isn't paradoxical. It doesn't lead to a contradiction. It leads to a conclusion that follows quite smoothly from its premises. It's a problem because although these premises seem independently quite reasonable, the conclusion that they force us to accept seems counterintuitive. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing that we can do is absolutely nothing. Just accept that sometimes moral intuitions go awry, that sometimes morality commits us to conclusions that seem a little odd to us and move on with our lives. And this is the strategy that the philosopher David Haig adopts. He says, look, the non-identity problem is no problem at all. It's a little weird, but morality's a little weird. But note that if we do this, we're not just going to have a counterintuitive conclusion in this particular case. Think of historical reparations. Often the strongest arguments that people offer as to why the descendants of African American slaves deserve compensation for what was done to their ancestors is by appealing to the fact that they can continue to suffer harms as a result of the atrocities that were committed against their ancestors. But given that those atrocities were a condition of their existence, given that they wouldn't exist had slavery not existed, then presumably it makes no sense to even be talking about historical reparations. So it seems like this is a pretty big bullet to bite. And if you agree with me, then we're going to have to find some way of showing that at least one of these premises is false. Let's focus on premise 2. An act harms someone if and only if it causes them to be worse off than they otherwise would have been. Note that this premise assumes what can be called a comparative account of harm. That is, it requires you to compare the state that you're in to a state that you counterfactually would have been in had some action not occurred. But perhaps we can develop a non-comparative account of harm that doesn't require us to appeal to that counterfactual. And this is the strategy that the philosophers Shauna Schifrin and Molly Gardner, who actually used to be a professor here a few years ago, this is the strategy that they both adopt. They try to come up with a non-comparative account of harm. And Schifrin does this by way of a really good thought experiment. So I want you to imagine that one day you're walking down the street, minding your own business, and then suddenly a gold bar falls and hits you on the head, leaving you mildly concussed. Now, Schifrin says, clearly you have been harmed. You've suffered a mild concussion. Now, suppose you get to keep the gold bar. Nobody else claims it. Well, that doesn't mean you haven't been harmed by the gold bar falling, Schifrin says. It just means that you've been harmed and then benefited above and beyond that harm by getting to keep the bar. So presumably we can say that you can be harmed, at least in some cases, without being left worse off. Now, Derek Parfit, who's the philosopher who popularized the non-identity problem, actually considered this as a possible response to it, and he was super unimpressed. And he was unimpressed because he thought that a non-comparative account of harm, even if we can develop one, simply just doesn't seem to carry much moral weight. Even if we can come up with it, in other words, why should we care about it morally? And you might capture this intuition by thinking about it in terms of compensation, right? If the gold bar falls on your head, leaving you mildly concussed, you might go up to the person who dropped it and say, look, you owe me some compensation, I'm concussed. And they could hand you the gold bar. And it seems like the problem's over at that point. Sure, you've been harmed, but you've been compensated above and beyond. And that's all morality is really going to care about. In much the same way, Jeremy might complain to his parents that he was harmed by being born with microcephaly, and they could say, yeah, sure, but we've already compensated you for that harm by giving you life. And surely your life, given that it's worth living, is sufficient compensation for this non-comparative harm. So let's look at premise 3. This is the premise that I think philosophers hate the most. And a lot of the solutions to the non-identity problem focus on it. If Jeremy wasn't harmed by an act, then he also wasn't wronged by it. Note that this premise assumes a very close connection between harming and wronging. A connection that some people might think really doesn't exist. Think about this thought experiment. Imagine an African-American woman named Sarah decides she wants to go out clubbing one night. She goes to a bar, and as it turns out, the bouncer at the door is just super racist, and he doesn't let her in. Now, later that night, people at this club start to get violently ill. It turns out that the alcohol shipment to the club earlier that day was contaminated, and everybody who's at the club that night suffers horrible gastrointestinal distress that leaves them out for basically a week. Now, I think we can say that Sarah was left better off because of the bouncer. Everybody else at the club is like retching in their bathroom, and Sarah gets to, just be watching Netflix or whatever else. But we can say that while still saying that the bouncer wronged Sarah. Why did he wrong her? Well, he wronged her because he failed to respect the right that she has to equal treatment, or the right that she has to not be discriminated on the basis of her race. So clearly we can say there are at least some cases where it's possible for an act to leave you better off while still wronging you. But then we just need to ask, is this what's going on in Jeremy's case? Well, we can't say that his parents had violated his right to equal treatment, right? That doesn't make any sense. And then we have to come up with some account as to what right he violated. And it's really, really difficult to figure out what that account would look like. So at most, putting pressure on premise 3 might require us to tweak the argument at least. Add in a premise saying that the decision didn't violate any of his rights, and then change a premise so that it now says if Jeremy wasn't harmed by an act, and if he didn't have any of his rights violated, then he also wasn't wronged by it. Now, these are just a few of the strategies that philosophers have attempted to use to get out of the non-identity problem. There are a few of many, many strategies, and yet there's no strategy that's ever managed to escape philosophical scrutiny. Given this, you might be tempted to just go back to what David Haidt did and bite the bullet, accept that the non-identity problem sometimes forces us to accept things that we might not otherwise want to accept. The problem with this, however, is that the non-identity problem isn't an isolated moral phenomenon. It's not an exceptional case. Rather, it rears its ugly head every single time we start to question what it is we owe to future generations or what past generations can be said to owe to us. If we don't come up with some way of grappling with it, we're going to end up being able to say nothing, presumably, about what we owe to people who don't yet exist. But it seems like we want to be able to say things like that. So think about global warming. Imagine if you had a politician who had read a lot of literature on the non-identity problem. Like he was philosophically savvy. Now, this is a thought experiment. We can go into it. And he says, look, I'm against any sort of environmental protection legislation. Why? Because climate change in the short term isn't that bad for us. I get warmer summers, I get to drive my helping SUV, I don't have to recycle. Climate change is sort of in the short term a sweet deal. The people who are going to be harmed by climate change, they're not going to exist for another 40, 50, 100 years. And they're also going to exist as a result of that climate change. If the climate doesn't change, different people will meet, different people will marry, people will be conceived at different times. Thus, the future people who are going to exist in a world of climate change, so long as their lives are worth living, and that's pretty fair to say they probably will be, won't be able to say that they were wronged by our inaction in any way. Our inaction, after all, is what caused them to exist. So if you're unimpressed with this sort of argument, you're going to have to find some way out of the non-identity problem.